Beyond Fukuyama. Where then do we stand today? How can we break out of the crisis of determinate negation and enact a subtraction in all its authentic violence? Gerald A. Cohen has enumerated the 4 features of the classical Marxist notion of the working class. 1. It constitutes the majority of society. 2. It produces the wealth of society. 3. It consists of the exploited members of society. 4. Its members are the needy people in society. When these 4 features are combined, they generate 2 further features. 5. The working class has nothing to lose from revolution. 6. It can and will engage in a revolutionary transformation of society. None of the first 4 features applies to the contemporary working class, which is why features 5 and 6 cannot be generated. Even if some of the features continue to apply to parts of today's society, they are no longer united in a single agent. The needy people in society are no longer the workers, and so on and so forth. Correct as it is, this enumeration should be supplemented by a systematic theoretical deduction. For Marx, they all follow from the basic position of a worker who has nothing but her labor power to sell. As such, workers are by definition exploited, with the progressive expansion of capitalism. They constitute the majority, which also produces the wealth, and so on. How then are we to redefine a revolutionary perspective in today's conditions? Is the way out of this predicament the combinatoire of multiple antagonisms, their potential overlappings? The underlying problem is, how are we to think the singular universality of the emancipatory subject as not purely formal, that is, as objectively materially determined, but without the working class as its substantial base? The solution is a negative one. It is capitalism itself which offers a negative substantial determination, for the global capitalist system is the substantial base which mediates and generates the excesses, slums, ecological threats, and so on, that open up sites of resistance. It is easy to make fun of Fukuyama's notion of the end of history, but the dominant ethos today is Fukuyamian. Liberal democratic capitalism is accepted as the finally found formula of the best possible society. All that one can do is render it more just, tolerant, and so forth. The only true question today is, do we endorse this naturalization of capitalism, or does contemporary global capitalism contain antagonisms which are sufficiently strong to prevent its indefinite reproduction? Let us cite 4 such antagonisms. Number 1, ecology. In spite of the infinite adaptability of capitalism, which, in the case of an acute ecological catastrophe or crisis, can easily turn ecology into a new field of capitalist investment and competition, the very nature of the risk involved fundamentally precludes a market solution. Why? Capitalism only works in precise social conditions. It implies trust in the objectivized, reified mechanism of the market's invisible hand, which, as a kind of cunning of reason, guarantees that the competition of individual egotisms works for the common good. However, we are currently experiencing a radical change. Up until now, historical substance, history as an objective process, obeying certain laws, played out its role as the medium and foundation of all subjective interventions. Whatever social and political subjects did, it was mediated and ultimately dominated, overdetermined by the historical substance. What looms on the horizon today is the unprecedented possibility that a subjective intervention will intervene directly into the historical substance, catastrophically disturbing its course by triggering an ecological catastrophe, a fateful biogenetic mutation, a nuclear or similar military social catastrophe, and so on. No longer can we rely on the safeguarding role of the limited scope of our acts. It no longer holds that whatever we do, history will carry on. For the first time in human history, the act of a single socio-political agent can really alter and even interrupt the global historical process. So that, ironically, it is only today that we can say that the historical process should effectively be conceived not only as substance, but also as subject. This is why, when confronted with singular catastrophic projects, say a political group which intends to attack its enemy with nuclear or biological weapons, we can no longer rely on the standard logic of the cunning of reason, which, precisely, presupposes the primacy of the historical substance over acting subjects. We can no longer adopt the stance of, let us call the bluff of the enemy who threatens us, for he will thereby self-destruct. The price for letting historical reason do its work is too high, since, in the meantime, we may all perish together with the enemy. Recall a frightening detail from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Only later did we learn how close to nuclear war we were during a naval skirmish between an American destroyer and a Soviet B-59 submarine off Cuba on October 27, 1962. The destroyer dropped depth charges near the submarine to try to force it to the surface, not knowing it had a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Vadim Orlov, a member of the submarine crew, told the conference in Havana that the submarine had been authorized to fire it if 3 officers agreed. The officers began a fierce shouting match over whether to sink the ship. 2 of them said yes, and the other said no. "A guy named Arkhipov saved the world," was the bitter comment of a historian on this incident. Number 2. The inadequacy of private property for so-called intellectual property. The key antagonism of the new digital industries is thus how to maintain the form of private property, within which the logic of profit can be maintained. See also the Napster problem, the free circulation of music. And do the legal complications in biogenetics not point in the same direction? A key element of the new international trade agreements is the protection of intellectual property. Whenever, in a merger, a big first-world company takes over a third-world company, the first thing they do is close down the research department. Phenomena emerge here which push the notion of property towards extraordinary dialectical paradoxes. In India, the local community suddenly discovered that medical practices and materials they have been using for centuries are now owned by American companies, so they should be bought from the latter. With the biogenetic companies patenting genes, we are all discovering that parts of ourselves, our genetic components, are already copyrighted, owned by others. The crucial date in the history of cyberspace was February the 3rd, 1976, the day when Bill Gates published his infamous open letter to hobbyists, the assertion of private property in the software domain. As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Most directly, the thing you do is theft. Bill Gates has built his entire empire and reputation on his extreme views about knowledge being treated as if it were tangible property. This was a decisive signal which triggered the battle for the enclosure of the common domain of software. Number 3. The socio-ethical implications of new techno-scientific developments, especially in biogenetics. Fukuyama himself was compelled to admit that biogenetic interventions into human nature are the most serious threat to his vision of the end of history. What is false about today's discussion concerning the ethical consequences of biogenetics, along with similar matters, is that it is rapidly turning into what the Germans called Bindenstrich-Ethik, the ethics of the hyphen, technology ethics, environment ethics, and so on. This ethics does have a role to play, a role homologous to that of the provisional ethic Descartes mentions at the beginning of his discourse on method. When we engage on a new path, full of dangers and shattering new insights, we need to stick to old established rules as a practical guide for our daily lives, although we are well aware that the new insights will compel us to provide a fresh foundation for our entire ethical edifice. In Descartes' case, this new foundation was provided by Kant, in his Ethics of Subjective Autonomy. Today, we are in the same predicament. Provisional ethics cannot replace the need for a profound reflection regarding the emerging new. In short, what gets lost here, in this hyphen ethics, is simply ethics as such. The problem is not that universal ethics gets dissolved into particular topics, but, quite on the contrary, that particular scientific breakthroughs are directly confronted with old humanist values. Say that biogenetics affects our sense of dignity and autonomy. This, then, is the choice we confront today. Either we choose the typically postmodern stance of reticence, let's not go to the end, let's keep a proper distance towards the scientific thing, so that this thing will not draw us into its black hole, destroying all our moral and human notions. Or we dare to tarry with the negative, das Verweilen beim Negativen. That is, we dare to fully assume the consequences of scientific modernity, with the wager that our mind is a genome, will also function as an infinite judgment. Number 4. And last but not least, new forms of apartheid, new walls and slums. On September 11, 2001, the Twin Towers were hit. 12 years earlier, on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. November 9th announced the happy 90s, the Fukuyama dream that liberal democracy had won, that the search was over, that the advent of a global liberal world community was lurking just around the corner, that the obstacles to this ultra-Hollywood-esque happy ending were merely empirical and contingent, local pockets of resistance where the leaders had not yet grasped that their time was over. In contrast, 9/11 is the key symbol of the end of the Clintonite happy 90s, of the era in which new walls are emerging everywhere, between Israel and the West Bank, around the European Union, along the US-Mexico border. So what if the new proletarian position is that of the inhabitants of slums in the new megalopolises? The explosive growth of slums over the last decades, especially in the third world megacities from Mexico City and other Latin American capitals through Africa, Lagos, Chad, to India, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia, is perhaps the crucial geopolitical event of our times. The case of Lagos, the biggest node in the shantytown corridor of 70 million people that stretches from Abidjan to Ibadan, is exemplary here. According to the official sources themselves, about 2/3 of Lagos State's total landmass, of 3,577 square kilometers, could be classified as shanties or slums. No one even knows the size of its population. Officially it is 6 million, but most experts estimate it at 10 million. Since, sometime very soon, or maybe, given the imprecision of the third world censuses, it has already happened, the urban population of the earth will outnumber the rural population. And since slum inhabitants will compose the majority of the urban population, we are in no way dealing with a marginal phenomenon. We are thus witnessing the fast growth of a population living outside state control, in conditions half outside the law, in terrible need of the minimal forms of self-organization. Although this population is composed of marginalized laborers, sacked civil servants, and ex-peasants, they are not simply a redundant surplus. They are incorporated into the global economy in numerous ways, many of them working as informal wage workers or self-employed entrepreneurs, with no adequate health or social security coverage. The main source of their emergence is the inclusion of third world countries in the global economy, with cheap food imports from the first world countries ruining local agriculture. They are the true symptom of slogans such as development, modernization, and the world market, not an unfortunate accident, but a necessary product of the innermost logic of global capitalism. No wonder that the hegemonic form of ideology in slums is Pentecostal Christianity, with its mixture of charismatic miracles and spectacles-oriented fundamentalism, and of social programs such as community kitchens and care of children and the old. While, of course, one should resist the easy temptation of elevating and idealizing the slum dwellers into a new revolutionary class, one should nonetheless, in Badiou's terms, perceive slums as one of the few authentic evental sites in contemporary society. The slum dwellers are literally a collection of those who are the part of no part, the supernumerary element of society, excluded from the benefits of citizenship, the uprooted and dispossessed, those who really have nothing to lose but their chains. It is indeed surprising how many features of slum dwellers fit the good old Marxist determination of the proletarian revolutionary subject. They are free in the double meaning of the word, even more than the classic proletariat. Freed from all substantial ties, dwelling in a free space, beyond the police regulations of the state. They are a large collective, forcibly thrown together, thrown into a situation where they have to invent some mode of being together, and simultaneously deprived of any support in traditional ways of life, in inherited religious or ethnic life forms. Of course, there is a crucial difference between the slum dwellers and the classical Marxist working class. While the latter is defined in the precise terms of economic exploitation, the appropriation of surplus value generated by the situation of having to sell one's labor power as a commodity on the market. The defining feature of the slum dwellers is socio-political. It concerns their non-integration into the legal space of citizenship with, most of, its incumbent rights. To put it in somewhat simplified terms, much more than a refugee, a slum dweller is a homo sacer, the systemically generated living dead of global capitalism. The slum dweller is a kind of negative of the refugee, a refugee from his own community, the figure that state power is not trying to control through concentration, where, to repeat the unforgettable pun from Ernst Lubitsch to be or not to be, those in power do the concentrating, while the refugees do the camping, but pushed into a space beyond control. In contrast to the Foucauldian micro-practices of discipline, with regard to slum dwellers, state power renounces its right to exert full control and discipline, finding it more appropriate to let them vegetate in the twilight zone. What one finds in the really existing slums is, of course, a mixture of improvised modes of social life, from criminal gangs and religious fundamentalist groups held together by a charismatic leader, up to and including seeds of new forms of socialist solidarity. The slum dwellers are the counterclass to the other newly emerging class, the so-called symbolic class, managers, journalists, and PR people, academics, artists, and so on, which is also uprooted and perceives itself as directly universal. A New York academic has more in common with a Slovene academic than with blacks in Harlem, half a mile from its campus. Is this the new axis of class struggle, or is the symbolic class inherently split, so that one can make the emancipatory wager on a coalition between the slum dwellers and the progressive part of the symbolic class? We should be looking for signs of the new forms of social awareness that will emerge from the slum collectives. They will be the germs of the future. Peter Hallward was right to point out that the poetics of resistance, of deterritorialized nomadic mobility, of creating ligne de fuite, of never being where one is expected to dwell, is not enough. The time has come to start creating what one is tempted to call liberated territories, the well-defined and delineated social spaces in which the reign of the system is suspended. A religious or artistic community, a political organization, and other forms of a place of one's own. This is what makes slums so interesting, their territorial character. While contemporary society is often characterized as the society of total control, slums are the territories within a state's frontiers from which the state has, partially at least, withdrawn its control. Territories which function as white spots, blanks, in the official map of a state territory. Although they are de facto included in a state by the links of the black economy, organized crime, religious groups, and so forth, the state's control is nonetheless suspended. They are domains outside the rule of law. In the map of Berlin that one could buy in the now defunct GDR, the area of West Berlin was left blank, a weird hole in the detailed structure of the big city. When Christa Wolf, the well-known East German half-dissident writer, took her small daughter to East Berlin's TV tower, from which one had a nice view over prohibited West Berlin, the small girl shouted happily, "Look, mother, it is not white over there. There are houses with people like here," as if discovering a hidden slum zone. This is why the destruction masses poor and deprived of everything, situated in a non-proletarianized urban environment, constitute one of the principal horizons of the politics to come. These masses, therefore, are an important factor in the phenomenon of globalization. A genuine form of globalization today will be found in the organization of these masses on a worldwide scale, if possible, whose conditions of existence are essentially the same. Whoever lives in the banlieues of Bamako or Shanghai is not essentially different from someone who lives in the banlieue of Paris or the ghettos of Chicago. Indeed, if the principal task of the emancipatory politics of the 19th century was to break the monopoly of the bourgeois liberals by politicizing the working class, and if the task of the 20th century was to politically awaken the immense rural populations of Asia and Africa, the principal task of the 21st century is to politicize, organize, and discipline the destructured masses of slum dwellers. Hugo Chávez's greatest achievement in the first years of his rule was precisely the politicization, inclusion into political life, social mobilization of slum dwellers. In other countries, they mostly persist in apolitical inertia. It was this political mobilization of the slum dwellers which saved him from a US-sponsored coup. To the surprise of everyone, Chávez included, the slum dwellers descended en masse to the affluent city center, tipping the balance of power to his advantage. The course on which Chávez embarked from 2006 is the exact opposite of the postmodern left's mantra regarding deterritorialization, rejection of statist politics, and so on. Far from resisting state power, he grabbed power, first by an attempted coup, then democratically, ruthlessly using the state apparatuses and interventions to promote his goals. Furthermore, he is militarizing the favelas, organizing the training of armed units. And the ultimate taboo, now that he is feeling the economic effects of the resistance to his rule by capital, temporary shortages of some goods in the state-subsidized supermarkets, he has announced the constitution of his own political party. Even some of his allies are skeptical about this move. Does it signal a return to the politics of the party state? However, one should fully endorse this risky choice. The task is to make this party function not like the usual populist or liberal parliamentary party, but as a focus for the political mobilization of new forms of politics, like the grassroots communal committees. So what should we say to someone like Chávez? No, do not grab state power, just subtract yourself, leave the laws of the state situation in place. Chávez is often dismissed as a clownish comedian, but would such a subtraction not really reduce him to a new version of Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatista movement in Mexico, to whom many leftists now rightly refer as Subcomediante Marcos? Today, it is the big capitalists, from Bill Gates to the ecological polluters, who resist the state. The four features presupposed in the Marxist notion of the proletariat are, of course, grounded in the singularly capitalist mechanism. They are four effects of the same structural cause. Is it possible to do the same with the four antagonisms that threaten the indefinite self-reproduction of global capital, to deduce them from the same cause? The task may appear almost as difficult as the great task of contemporary physics, the development of a unified theory, which would deduce the four fundamental forces: gravity, electricity and magnetism, weak atomic force, strong atomic force, from one and the same underlying feature or law. Perhaps one could even map Cohen's four features onto the second tetrad. The majority principle appears as ecology, a topic which concerns us all. Poverty characterizes those who are excluded and live in slums. Wealth production is more and more something which depends on scientific and technological developments like biogenetics. And finally, exploitation reappears in the impasses of intellectual property, where the owner exploits the results of collective labor. The four features form a kind of semiotic square, the intersection of two oppositions along the lines of society-nature and inside-outside, the social wall of a new apartheid. Ecology designates the outside of nature, slums the social outside, biogenetics the natural inside, and intellectual property the social inside. Why is this overlapping of the four antagonisms not the Laclauian empty signifier, the people, filled in through the process of the struggle for hegemony? Why is it not yet another attempt in the series of the rainbow coalitions of oppressed sexual minorities, ethnic and religious groups, and so forth? Because we still need a proletarian position, the position of the part of no part. In other words, if one wants an older model, it is rather the trusty communist formula of the alliance of workers, poor farmers, patriotic petty bourgeoisie, and honest intellectuals. Note how the four terms are not at the same level. Only workers are listed as such, while the other three are qualified: poor farmers, patriotic petty bourgeoisie, honest intellectuals. Exactly the same goes for today's four antagonisms. It is the antagonism between the excluded and the included, which is the zero-level antagonism, coloring the entire terrain of struggle. Consequently, only those ecologists are included who do not use ecology to legitimize the oppression of the polluting poor, trying to discipline the third world countries. Only those critics of biogenetic practices who resist the conservative, religious humanist ideology, which all too often sustains this critique. Only those critics of intellectual private property who do not reduce the problem to a legalistic issue. There is thus a qualitative difference between the gap that separates the excluded from the included and the other three antagonisms, which designate three domains of what Hart and Negri call the commons, the shared substance of our social being, whose privatization is a violent act, which should also be resisted with violence, if necessary. The commons of culture, the immediately socialized forms of cognitive capital, primarily language, our means of communication and education. If Bill Gates were allowed a monopoly, we would reach the absurd situation in which a private individual would literally own the software texture of our basic network of communication. But also the shared infrastructure of public transport, electricity, post, etc. The commons of external nature threatened by pollution and exploitation, from oil to forests and the natural habitat itself. The commons of internal nature, the biogenetic inheritance of humanity. What all these struggles share is the awareness of the destructive potential up to and including the self-annihilation of humanity itself, if the capitalist logic of enclosing these commons is allowed a free run. It is this reference to commons, this substance of productivity, which is neither private nor public, which justifies the resuscitation of the notion of communism. The commons can thus be linked to what Hegel, in his phenomenology, deployed as die Sache, the shared social thing cause, the work of all and everyone, the substance kept alive by incessant subjective productivity.